Howdy, my name is Ted Campbell. I live in the Dallas neighborhood of Forest Meadow. I teach history at Southern Methodist University here in Dallas, church history or Christian history in particular. But lately I've become interested in the history of this neighborhood, Forest Meadow, and the adjacent neighborhoods of Town Creek and Moss Farm. So I want to show y'all a little bit of what I've learned about the history of this area that I'm going to call Houxland. A good starting place is the old Mount Calvary Cemetery on Valley View Lane in Richardson. This row of headstones at Mount Calvary tells a series of sad stories about a pioneer family named Hawks, spelled H-O-U-X. The oldest recorded burial at the Mount Calvary Cemetery is that of Amanda L. Hawks, a native of Kentucky who came to Texas with her husband James M. Hawks in 1847. Very shortly after arriving in Texas, Amanda died on June 30th of that year, 1847. Further down the row, we find the grave of her son, Nicholas T. Hawks, who was born on June 30th, 1847. And that, of course, is the day on which his mother died. So Amanda Hawks died in childbirth or in complications from childbirth. Amanda's husband, James M. Hawks, died a few years later, and an unmarked space next to the grave of Amanda Hawks may mark his grave. Their deaths left their son Nicholas Hawks at age 3, an orphan on the Texas frontier. As we will see, little Nicholas had the good fortune of being adopted by Judge John S. Thomas and his wife Hannah, and Nicholas would eventually become the first settler on the land that is now the Dallas neighborhoods of Forest Meadow, Town Creek, and Moss Farm. But a few more tragedies were to befall him. Nicholas married a woman named Mary Elizabeth Kemper around 1874. Late in the next year, about December 1875, they had a daughter they named Edney, but Edney died 9 months later in September 1876. And her grave would still have been fresh when her mother died 3 weeks later and was buried next to her in October 1876. Perhaps both of them succumbed to the same illness. Nicholas would remarry within a couple of years, and his second wife Maggie had a daughter who survived, a daughter named Hannah, named for Nicholas' adopted mother. But Nicholas himself died in 1890 at the age of 42. Maggie remarried, and she and Hannah eventually moved away from the Dallas area. The memory of the Hawks family has not been cultivated in this area. They moved to Texas, where a series of tragedies befell them, and Nicholas' one surviving daughter moved away. So they have been unsung pioneers, at least until now. I'm going to call the land they settled Houxland, a word I just made up to describe the land that would become the 3 Dallas neighborhoods of Forest Meadow, Moss Farm, and Town Creek. The area I'm calling Houxland is part of the Central and North Texas Blackland Prairie, a band of fertile prairie with rich, dark soil that extends in a diagonal line from the Oklahoma border near Paris, Texas, all the way down to the Texas Hill Country, roughly following the current route of I-35. The black soil of this area lies over a formation of chalky limestone that geologists call the Austin Formation. White Rock Creek is named for the gray-white limestone of the Austin Formation that appears in the bed of the creek and along its sides. The Blackland Prairie has a profusion of wild grasses interspersed with scrubby trees. Larger hardwoods grow along the many streams that cut across the prairie. A section of Harry S. Moss Park at the corner of Royal Lane and Arborside Drive has recultivated native grasses of the region, and it gives us a sense of how a little portion of this prairie may have looked before settlement began. The most prominent natural feature of this area is White Rock Creek, which flows across northern Dallas County from northwest to southeast. White Rock Creek lies at the southern edge of the area we're calling Houxland. 2 tributaries mark the eastern and western boundaries of this area. Jackson Branch on the east flows south from the lake at Richland College. Richardson Branch on the west closely follows the route of North Greenville Avenue. Richardson Branch is really just a little ditch whose headwaters are in the Kroger parking lot near the corner of Forest and Greenville. The elevation of this area rises 150 feet from about 470 feet above sea level at the bed of White Rock Creek to 620 feet above sea level at a point on Forest Lane where a municipal water reservoir is located. Anyone who's ridden a bicycle from south to north in this area can confirm this. As you may know, Dallas does not really have hills until you get on a bicycle, and then they magically rise up from the earth. Humans have lived in this area for a long time. In the period prior to European settlement, Indians of the Southern Plains hunted and sometimes settled in this area. From at least the 1700s, the Wichita tribe had moved south into Texas, extending as far south as present-day Waco. In fact, the Waco Indians are one of the affiliated tribes allied to the Wichita. So are the Tawakoni, in honor of whom Lake Tawakoni is named, and for whom the town of Tawakona near Mahia is also named. The Wichita Indians built large houses thatched from native prairie grasses, and these structures had a unique appearance, something like a beehive. In the summer, they also used outdoor arbors for shelter. By the early 1800s, the Nadako or Anadarko people, a group allied with the Caddo Confederacy of what is now East Texas, had moved northwest to the Forks of the Trinity, as the Dallas area was called. Just before European settlers arrived in this area, some other American Indian groups, such as the Cherokee, forced from their native homelands in the east, appeared in this area. Early settlers interacted with native peoples, but by the 1880s, almost all of the American Indian groups of this area had been removed to reservations in Oklahoma. So far as we know, there were no settlements of people other than American Indians in the area that's now Dallas County during the period of Spanish Texas from 1519 to the time when Mexico became independent between 1810 and 1821, although the area was explored in that period. Nor were there settlements during the period when this area was part of the Mexican state of Coahuila y Texas between 1821 and 1836. The settlement of this area by immigrants from the United States did not begin until the early 1840s when Texas was an independent republic. The process by which early settlers claimed land in the area was governed by a unique system that had grown up during Mexican sovereignty. Settlements in the Mexican state of Coahuila y Texas and then in the Republic of Texas were administered by companies, empresas, led by businessmen, empresarios, whom the governments licensed to distribute land according to specific requirements that each company had negotiated. In this area, that authority had been granted to the Peters Colony, which was not so much a colony as a corporation established by an English immigrant to the United States, William S. Peters, between 1841 and 1843. The corporation was organized under the Republic of Texas with capital funding raised both in England and in the United States. The Peters Colony had responsibility for a vast range of North Texas, including all of what would become the Dallas area. The company, however, proved ineffective. Its main offices were located in the music shop of Peters' son in Louisville, Kentucky, and local agents tried to control land claims very strictly, leading colonists to suspect that the company was angling to hold on to as much land as possible. A group of irate colonists in Collin County attacked one of its agents in 1852, London native Henry O. Hedgecox, in an incident exaggeratedly called the Hedgecox War. From this point, county governments and the General Land Office established under the Republic of Texas adjudicated land claims, although the specific settlement terms negotiated by the Peters Colony Corporation continued to apply. Because the Peters Colony was based in Louisville, many settlers came from Kentucky and Tennessee. But I've found that they came by way of central Missouri, where many of them settled en route to Texas. 4 families of settlers, including the Hawks family, seem to have traveled along closely parallel journeys that led them from Kentucky and Tennessee through central Missouri to the Peters Colony in the 1840s. These four families would settle very close together on or near the land that would become Forest Meadow, Town Creek, and Moss Farm. The Prigmore family originated in the southern shires of England and migrated to Middlesex County, New Jersey around 1670. The family was in New Jersey for almost 100 years. Then around 1759 they moved to Frederick, Maryland, nestled up against the first range of the Appalachians, a gateway to the west for pioneers. Around 1803, the Prigmore family migrated to Greene County and then Allen County, Kentucky. Around 1817, some of the Prigmores moved to Cooper County and Lafayette County, Missouri, an area in central Missouri sometimes called Little Dixie because it attracted so many settlers from southern states. It was from this area of Missouri that the family of Joseph Prigmore and his wife Mahala and their 6 children set out for Texas in 1844. Their son Benjamin was 13 when they came to Texas, and he would later write a lively account of their immigration to the Republic of Texas. The trail they followed from Missouri to Texas was an old path that came to be called the Shawnee Trail. It was a trail that had been used by American Indians and also served as a cattle trail. The Shawnee Trail stretched from central Missouri through eastern Oklahoma, where it was called the Texas Road. The trail branched at many points, and it crossed the Red River at different fords. A western branch of the trail crossed the Red River at the Preston Bend. This branch of the trail from Preston Bend to Cedar Springs was called Preston Road, and that name persists to this day. An eastern branch of the trail crossed the Red River north of present-day Denison, Texas, a crossing that would later be called Colbert's Ferry. The route of the eastern branch is roughly that of US 75 today. Near Dallas, it followed the route of North Greenville Avenue, passing right by the area that I'm calling Houxland. The Prigmore family seems to have come to Texas by the eastern fork of the trail, since Benjamin Prigmore mentioned that they had camped on the east fork of the Trinity River, where McKinney is located today. They also branched west for a while and considered the land in what is now Denton County before settling on property near the present corner of Royal Lane and Abrams Road. Another pioneer family that followed this trail along with the Prigmores was the family of John Hayes Jackson, his wife Elizabeth, and their 11 children. The Jackson family had come to America from County Antrim in Northern Ireland around 1760. They originally settled in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, which itself was an important conduit for settlers moving west. Around 1785, the Jackson family had migrated to Blount County in what is now the state of Tennessee. Around 1840, a group of their descendants moved to Howard County in central Missouri, and it was from there that they set out for Texas, perhaps along with the Prigmores, in 1844. The Jacksons would settle just east of the area where Town Creek is located today, and Benjamin Prigmore would marry Nancy Lucinda Jackson, one of the children of John and Elizabeth Jackson. Another one of their children, Andrew Sloan Jackson, would acquire property adjacent to that of the Hawks family. A third family that moved to Texas at about the same time was the family of John Henry Somerville Thomas. The Thomas family originated in Wales, and they had migrated to eastern Pennsylvania in the early 1700s. In the 1770s or 1780s, the Thomas family migrated from Pennsylvania to Sevier County in what is now eastern Tennessee. Around 1832, John S. Thomas and his wife Hannah migrated to Jackson County, Missouri, in the same area of central Missouri where the Jackson and Prigmore families had settled. The Thomases, along with their 8 children and some slaves, came to the Peters Colony in about 1844, perhaps traveling there in the company of the Prigmores and the Jacksons. John and Hannah Thomas settled near the present intersection of Preston Road and Walnut Hill Lane. John Thomas would become the first county judge in Dallas County, and they became the adoptive parents of Nicholas Hawks. The Hawks family followed a similar path of migration as these other 3 families, but the Hawks family was not British in its origins. The ancestors of the Hawks family were in Lorraine, between France and Germany, in the early 1700s. By the 1720s, they had moved to Württemberg, now the state of Baden-Württemberg, along the Rhine River in southern Germany. In the 1750s, a group of Hawks family members immigrated to the British North American colonies and settled in Frederick, Maryland, at about the same time that the ancestors of the Prigmore family had settled there. Frederick, Maryland was not only a gateway to the west, but it also included German settlers who had come down from Pennsylvania as its earliest residents. The Hawks family migrated from Maryland to Kentucky around 1796. A little more than 20 years later, about 1819, they migrated to Cooper County, Missouri, where the Prigmore family had also settled. In central Missouri, the Hawks family came to be known as staunch adherents of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. Although James M. Hawks and his wife Amanda were both born in Kentucky, they had probably grown up in Missouri, and they came to Texas in 1847, following the same trail as other settlers from central Missouri who had come here in the 1840s. As we've already seen, their coming to Texas was followed within a few months by the birth of Nicholas T. Hawks and the death of Amanda Hawks on June 30th, 1847. 2 years after Amanda died, in October 1849, James M. Hawks purchased a tract of 306 acres on White Rock Creek from a William M. Simpson. The earliest land grants in this area straddled White Rock Creek. They were laid out as rectangular tracts that you can see on this map, tracts of 1,280 acres each, 2 square miles each, but set at a 45-degree angle so that the creek ran roughly through the middle of each grant. 2 veterans of the Texas Revolutionary Army, David Barron and Neil McCraney, had received certificates that allowed them to claim property as payment for their military service. As many recipients of these certificates did, Barron and McCraney sold their certificates to a land speculator, William M. Simpson, who in turn parceled the land and sold it to early settlers. The original property purchased by James M. Hawks was a portion of one of these larger grants, the Neil McCraney grant that had been acquired by William M. Simpson. Hawks's property was surveyed in May 1850, and the survey shows that the property was located at the confluence of Richardson Branch and White Rock Creek. This map shows his purchase as the lower tract that would be inherited by his son Nicholas Hawks. Its western property line followed Richardson Branch to the north, which is to say that it roughly followed the present path of Greenville Avenue, which I believe to have been an eastern branch of the Shawnee Trail. We do not know if James M. Hawks began to utilize the property that he had purchased, but he died within a couple of years of purchasing the property. He may be buried at the Mount Calvary Cemetery, though no marker is present for him. There is a record of a burial of a James M. Hawks in central Missouri in 1852, so it's possible that he had returned to Missouri after purchasing his property in Texas. In any event, his death left his son Nicholas T. Hawks as an orphan. The 1850 federal census for Dallas County, recorded in mid-November of that year, shows N.T. Hawks in the household of John S. and Hannah Thomas. If his father had returned to Missouri, then Nicholas was simply staying with the Thomas family, anticipating his father's return. But within the decade of the 1850s, after the death of his father, Nicholas Hawks was adopted by the Thomas family. By the time Nicholas Hawks came to live with John and Hannah Thomas, they were in their mid-50s, and only 2 of their own children were still living with them. John S. Thomas, the adopted father of Nicholas Hawks, served as the first county judge of Dallas County between 1846 and 1848. He was an early settler who knew the Peters Colony settlement provisions and used them for himself and his children. He himself received a headright grant, a grant made to early settlers of 640 acres, and his children also applied for and received large grants of land in the area. Although Nicholas Hawks was a child when he came to live with the Thomas family, he received a land grant signed by Texas Governor E.M. Pease. Nicholas Hawks was only 8 years old when he received this grant, so it looks like John S. and Hannah Thomas, concerned for the future well-being of their adopted son, went through the process of obtaining this land grant on his behalf. This is what they called a Nacogdoches third-class grant, which made a total of 640 acres available to settlers who had arrived in the Republic of Texas between October 1, 1837 and January 1, 1840. The Peters colony had extended the provision of these headright grants to settlers who had arrived for some years after 1840. This meant that although Nicholas Hawks was not himself eligible, his father, James M. Hawks, had been eligible for such a grant as an early settler, and so the application was made in the name of the heirs of James M. Hawks. This grant is what I've called the upper tract of the Hawks property. 640 acres is a square mile, but this grant was not square. Its northern boundary followed the present route of Forest Lane from a point west of Greenville to Jackson Branch, east of where the LBJ Freeway runs today. The eastern side of the property was a straight line running from north to south through the bed of Jackson Branch down to where Royal Lane is now. The property line followed the current route of Royal Lane for just a little ways westward, then cut back to the original boundary at a 45-degree angle, following the property line of the lower tract that James Hawks had acquired and that Nicholas had inherited. In the federal census of 1860, John S. and Hannah Thomas were shown as owning considerable property. Their 12-year-old adopted son, Nicholas Hawks, is shown as owning land valued at $4,730 and other property valued at $300. The former figure represents both the lower tract that he had inherited from his father and the upper tract that he had received as a grant from the state. 10 years later, in 1870, he was shown living in an area associated with the Breckenridge post office. He appears in this census immediately after the family of John B. Floyd, another Kentucky family that settled the area that would become the Restland Cemetery about a mile and a half north of Hawks's upper tract. Nicholas Hawks was 13 years old when the Civil War began, and to my knowledge he did not serve in the Civil War, presumably because of his young age. After the Civil War, he married a woman named Mary Elizabeth Kemper, mentioned earlier, on August 30th, 1874. Mary Kemper had been born in St. Mary's Parish, Louisiana, in 1850. St. Mary's Parish is one of the easternmost and earliest settled parishes of Louisiana, but her family had been on the move. They lived in Calcasieu Parish in southwestern Louisiana in 1860. 6 years later, her father died in Nacogdoches County, Texas, and after his death, Mary Elizabeth's mother, Sena Hunter Kemper, came to North Dallas County with several of her children, including Mary Elizabeth, and here she met Nicholas Hawks. Mary Elizabeth and Nicholas Hawks had a daughter named Edney, born around December 1875, a year after their marriage. But Edney died in September of the next year, 1876, and Mary Elizabeth died within 3 weeks of her in October 1876. They are buried together between Nicholas Hawks's mother Amanda and Mary Elizabeth's mother Sena Kemper in the Mount Calvary Cemetery. After the deaths of Edney and Mary Elizabeth, Nicholas Hawks married a woman named Maggie Bell Norman in 1878. Maggie was 13 years younger than Nicholas, having been born in 1860. The 1880 census showed them living in the vicinity of Benjamin J. Prigmore. Nicholas was listed as a farmer, and the fact that he is shown very close to Prigmore indicates that he and Maggie Hawks were farming the upper and lower tracts, since a tract adjacent to the Hawks upper tract had been acquired by Benjamin J. Prigmore in the late 1860s. In 1885, Nicholas and Maggie had a daughter, Hannah Virginia Hawks, who would inherit the Hawks property. The Hawks properties and other early properties in the area had been subdivided from at least the late 19th century. Surveys of the property in the Dallas County Clerk's office show a number of divisions to the Hawks property, some perhaps of 100 acres or more, but most of them smaller than that. At least a small portion remained in the possession of Maggie Hawks and then her daughter Hannah Hawks Hunt. We know who some of the Hawks family's neighbors were in this area. On the same day in October 1849, when James M. Hawks bought the lower tract of 306 acres from William Simpson, Simpson sold 2 other grants of land nearby. One of these grants was to Andrew Sloan Jackson, the son of John Hayes and Elizabeth Jackson. Sloan Jackson, as he was called, purchased land in the McCraney Grant, just east of the lower Hawks tract. The southeastern corner of the present Moss Farm neighborhood was part of Sloan Jackson's property. Although Sloan Jackson was shown in the 1850 census in his parents' household, he married a woman named Elizabeth Dye in 1851, and they settled on the land that he had acquired. Sloan Jackson was only 4 years older than Nicholas Hawks, and his family would be the Hawks family's closest neighbors. Nicholas Hawks' stepbrother Alexander Thomas, one of the children of John and Hannah Thomas, had purchased land in the David Barron grant from William Simpson in 1849, on the same day when James M. Hawks purchased the Lower Hawks tract and when Andrew Sloan Jackson purchased his property. The Alexander Thomas property was roughly where the Stultz Road neighborhood is located today. Alexander Thomas, his wife Mary, and their 6 daughters were also neighbors of the Hawks family. Close by the Hawks property were grants to Joseph Prigmore and his son Benjamin J. Prigmore, the family that had traveled the Shawnee Trail from Missouri to Texas in 1844. Joseph Prigmore received a grant of 479 acres in 1855, adjacent to the southeastern corner of the Hawks property. Benjamin J. Prigmore, Joseph's son, received a grant of 320 acres in 1866, south of the present site of Richland College. Forest Lane Academy, a Richardson ISD elementary school, is now situated on the land that was Ben and Lucy Prigmore's farm. Benjamin Prigmore later became part of the Dallas County Pioneers Association and gave a lively account of his family's journey from Missouri to Texas in the Dallas Morning News in 1891, and his story illustrates the life of these early settlers. According to Benjamin Prigmore, early settlers raised corn, wheat, including winter wheat crops, oats, and cotton. He indicated that cotton production came to prominence after the Civil War. Benjamin J. Prigmore married Nancy Lucinda or Lucy Jackson, one of the granddaughters of John Hayes Jackson. Her father's property was adjacent to Ben Prigmore's grant. Benjamin and Lucy Prigmore are buried in the McCree Cemetery off Audelia Road. About a mile and a half north of the Hawks property, past the current route of the LBJ Freeway, another Kentucky native named John B. Floyd had bought 900 acres in 1855, same year as the grant to the heirs of James M. Hawks. The Floyd property, including the family graveyard, eventually became the nucleus of Restland, and the Pioneer Cemetery in the middle of Restland includes the graves of John Floyd and his wife Julia Ann. The 1870 census of Dallas County had shown Nicholas Hawks listed immediately after the family of John B. Floyd in the area of the Breckenridge post office. This leads me to think that in 1870 there was just about nothing between the Floyd residence, now Restland, and the area where Nicholas Hawks' farm was located, where Forest Meadow and Town Creek and Moss Farm are now located. The Floyd family, like the Thomas family, had owned slaves in the period between their coming to Dallas County in the early 1850s and the Civil War, following which slavery was abolished. So slavery was practiced in this general area in its first 20 years of settlement, though not, to my knowledge, on the land that became Moss Farm, Town Creek, and Forest Meadow. About a mile east of the Floyd property, near the current site of Richland College, was a small community called Breckenridge. The Breckenridge community had a post office until 1874. Tennessee native James Everett Jackson, a son of John and Elizabeth Jackson, had settled on this land. John and Elizabeth Jackson's farm just southeast of him spawned another small community called Audelia, named for one of James Everett Jackson's daughters, whose name was Ellen Ardelia Jackson. Audelia Road was named for this community located on the southeast corner of property lines that are now Audelia Road and Forest Lane. The Audelia community had a post office between 1899 and 1904. Older maps show it as having a school and a cotton gin in the early 20th century. A few miles east of the Audelia community was a community originally called Duck Creek, where a number of early settlers lived, a community that eventually would come to be called Garland. Our pioneer settler Nicholas Hawks died of pneumonia on Tuesday, February 25, 1890, at the age of 42. He was buried the next day in Mount Calvary Cemetery in the same row as his mother, his first wife Mary Elizabeth, their daughter Edney, and his mother-in-law Sina Kemper. The Dallas Morning News carried the following notice of his death on Thursday, February 27th. Mr. Nick Hawks died last Tuesday morning of pneumonia at his residence near White Rock and within 2 miles of the house in which he was born. His parents dying while he was an infant, he was raised by Mrs. Judge J. Thomas, the grandmother of Mrs. Record of Dallas. The deceased was buried yesterday at Mount Calvary. Within a few years after her husband's death, Maggie Hawks remarried a Mr. Robert S. Riley, and they eventually moved to Ashland, Oregon. Maggie Hawks died in January 1935 in Los Angeles, returning to Oregon from a Christmas visit to her daughter Hannah in Dallas. The Dallas Morning News carried an obituary noting that she was an early resident of the Dallas area. Nicholas Hawks had lived to see the coming of railroads to this area. The railroads were the first stage in the urbanization of this area because they linked the area with Dallas and with the growing network of rail lines that radiated out from Dallas. In 1873, the Houston and Texas Central Railroad, the H&TC, was extended north from Dallas. The old H&TC Railroad corridor is now the path of the Dart Red Line extending to the north. The Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad, also called the MKT or Katy Railroad, was extended to the Dallas area around 1885 and would take the path that is now the Dart Blue Line east of Town Creek. The coming of the railroads shifted the communities of the area, spawning some new ones that grew up around railroad stops and causing some older communities to disappear. Richardson was founded as a stop on the H&TC in 1873 and was named for railroad contractor E.H. Richardson. The location of the stop at Richardson caused a swift exodus of businesses from the older Breckenridge community. Within a year, the Breckenridge post office had ceased to function. Similarly, the congregation of the older Mount Calvary Baptist Church on the site of the Mount Calvary Cemetery moved to Richardson in 1885 and became the nucleus of the First Baptist Church of Richardson. Some early 20th century maps of this area show a stop on the H&TC rail line labeled Bouchard just west of Stoltz Road on what is now Floyd Lake Road, across Floyd's branch from the present Forest Road Dart Rail Station. The name is carried on older topographical maps, but the tiny Bouchard community never had its own post office, so Bouchard was probably what they called a whistle stop. East of this area, the Katy Railroad bypassed the Duck Creek settlement. Some Duck Creek residents relocated, forming a community that for a while was called New Duck Creek. Others selected a different location on the rail line, and their community was called Embry. After a few years of competition, the New Duck Creek and Embry folks collaborated to incorporate a town that from 1891 was called Garland. South of the Houxland area, older maps show a stop on the H&TC at the Vickery community. The rail stop was very close to the current Park Lane Dart Rail Station, but the Vickery post office was located at the intersection of Abrams and Skillman. Vickery remained a separate community with its own identity into the 1950s when it was annexed by the city of Dallas. From 1883, Nicholas Hawks and his second wife Maggie Hawks had begun to sell parcels of the property, including substantial amounts of property in both of the earlier tracts that was sold to Duck Creek pioneer settler W.W. Sebastian. William Whiteside Sebastian, who had settled in the Duck Creek community, eventually purchased land in this area amounting to 640 acres. Although this property did not correspond to the earlier Hawks tracts, Sebastian's property included much of the old Hawks property that is now Forest Meadow, Moss Farm, and Town Creek. William Sebastian is considered to be a Dallas County pioneer, although of a later generation than the Hawks family. He had served as a captain in the Civil War and had moved to Dallas County with his family in 1872. Sebastian lived closer to Garland, where he also held property. He died in 1898 and is buried in the Garland Mills Memorial Cemetery at the intersection of Saturn Road and Miller Road. William Sebastian not only cultivated cotton on this land, but he and his children also utilized the land as a stock farm, raising Hereford and Holstein cattle. The pattern of using the land as a stock farm would be followed in the 20th century by Harry S. Moss. Through the early 20th century, the area that is now Forest Meadow, Town Creek, and Moss Farm became more and more a part of the growing Dallas area. In 1916, the road that is now North Greenville Avenue was designated as Texas State Highway 6, and it extended from Dallas north to the Red River. It was also called the Richardson Road in that period. In 1924, the Restland Memorial Park was developed on the old John B. Floyd property, retaining the Floyd family cemetery as the pioneer cemetery there. In the same year, the highway was paved with brick in Richardson, where it came to be known as the Red Brick Road. 2 years later, in 1926, the highway was redesignated as U.S. Highway 75 and remained so until North Central Expressway was constructed in the 1950s. Early 20th century maps show the current route of Abrams Road with a number of older curves and zigzags that were later straightened out. This suggests to me that some version of Abrams Road had been in place since the late 1800s or the early 1900s. I wonder if it was an alternative route for the north-northeasterly trail that became Greenville Avenue. The road that is now Forest Lane had earlier been a property boundary. It was the northern boundary of the Hawks Upper Tract. Maps and plats from the early 20th century show this road, sometimes identified as the Garland and Grapevine Road, and they indicate that it was a gravel road for a long time. Dallas County has an extensive collection of aerial photographs that show this area in 1942, 1950, 1964, and 1978. The following sequence of photographs of the corner of Greenville Avenue and Forest Lane shows that the area was primarily rural through the early 1960s. Although this area remained rural through the 1960s, it was not unusual for people who worked in the cities to have suburban farms, that is, homes and acreage in the vicinity of the city where they could carry on a semblance of rural life. An example of a suburban farm in our area was the homestead of the Bill Brown family, whose land is now part of Forest Meadow. Dallas oil producer W.A. Bill Brown was a native of Little Rock, Arkansas, who had come to Texas as a young man in 1919 and developed oil fields both in East Texas and in West Texas. In 1942, he married Catherine W. Irwin, and they purchased a 25-acre farm on Forest Lane, part of the old Hawks Upper Tract. An aerial photo of the corner of Forest and Greenville taken in 1950 shows the Brown farm at the end of a curved drive that extended down from Forest Lane into what is now Forest Meadow. By the time of Bill Brown's death in 1956, the family had a home in Longview, Texas, near the East Texas oil field, as well as their farm in North Dallas. After Bill Brown's death, Catherine Brown married a Mr. Penner, and they continued to live at the farm, the address of which was 9190 Forest Lane, through the 1970s. I doubt that a 25-acre farm would have been used to produce grain or cotton. Like other smaller suburban farms, I would guess that it had a barn with a cow for fresh milk, maybe a horse or two for pleasure riding, perhaps a chicken coop for fresh eggs, and a vegetable plot. A much more substantial suburban farm was built by one of the most colorful residents of this area in the mid-20th century. Harry S. Moss was born in 1888 in Ontario, Canada. He moved to Texas around 1906 and became involved in the Texas oil industry from its earliest years, forming the Moss Petroleum Company around 1920. He and his family resided on Armstrong Parkway in Highland Park, but in the 1930s he bought a Hereford bull at the Texas State Fair, and then he realized that he had no place to keep it. So he purchased a stable and adjacent lands in Dallas County, eventually developing a 400-acre farm that came to be known as the Moss Haven Stock Farm. Although it was a working stock farm, the farm also served as a weekend and holiday residence for the Moss family. The Moss home was called Moss Haven and was built onto an earlier and simpler house that may have been the home of pioneer settler Andrew Sloan Jackson. The house was extensively renovated by the Moss family and was featured in a 1958 issue of Architectural Digest. The Moss Haven home is located in the Moss Farm neighborhood, just behind Moss Haven Elementary School. A large part of the Moss Haven stock farm, including the old Moss farmhouse, would later become the Moss Farm neighborhood, but a substantial 250-acre portion was donated to the city of Dallas and is now the Harry S. Moss Park. This area underwent a further transformation following World War II, when it became a fully suburban part of the Dallas urban area. Suburban life was built around personal mobility by way of the automobile, and part of the infrastructure that enabled the suburban expansion of U.S. cities in the post-war period was the building of freeways. North Central Expressway was the Dallas area's first freeway. It generally followed the route of the H&TC rail line, but was laid out just west of the rail line. The completion of Lake Texoma in 1944 had cut off the old Preston Road so that it could no longer serve as a northern route into Oklahoma, and US 75 became the principal highway extending to the north from Dallas. For a few decades, US Route 75 followed North Greenville Avenue, and there were motels located along Greenville Avenue to accommodate travelers to the area. The first section of North Central Expressway was opened in 1950, but it was not completed from downtown Dallas even as far as Mockingbird Lane until 1952. Between then and 1956, the freeway was extended to Campbell Road in Richardson. In the same year, 1956, Texas Instruments opened its first buildings on its new Richardson campus. By the 1960s, construction was underway on the LBJ freeway, and in January 1969, the stretch of the freeway between U.S. Highway 75 and Mesquite was opened, passing within a quarter mile of the intersection of Forest and Abrams. By that time, suburban homes were being built in Forest Meadow. It was during this period, when the freeways were being built and the suburbs were expanding, that this area was incorporated into the city of Dallas. The 1961 issue of Polk's Greater Dallas City Directory was the first directory to list addresses on Greenville Avenue north of where Meadow Road is today. It was also the first directory to list addresses on Forest Lane between Greenville and Abrams, and there weren't many residential or business addresses listed on either of those streets. But suburban areas had been extending from Dallas since the end of the Second World War. One of the first suburban neighborhoods to be developed close by this area was Hamilton Park. In early 1953, Dallas residents passed a bond issue for the expansion of Love Field that entailed the destruction of many homes in a black neighborhood nearby. Leaders of the black community in Dallas worked to secure a new neighborhood to address the needs of the growing black middle class and professional community in the city, facing considerable opposition from civic leaders in their efforts. The Hamilton Park neighborhood was opened for development on 233 acres of land north of Forest Lane in October 1953. The neighborhood was named for Dr. Richard T. Hamilton, a physician and leader of the Dallas black community in this period. The neighborhood is celebrated in a contemporary sculpture at the Forest Lane Dart Rail Station. It depicts an open door with the inscription, "To those African Americans who struggled against the mainstream to open the doors to decent residential housing." The opening of the Hamilton Park neighborhood was not only a victory for the black community in Dallas, it also turned out to be a financial success, demonstrating the need for housing for the growing black professional community in this area. By the early 1960s, a similar neighborhood was being developed nearby just west of Greenville Avenue. This neighborhood was originally called Northwood Estates and was also marketed to middle-class black families, though today I find it more commonly referred to as the Stults Road neighborhood. While the Hamilton Park and Stults Road neighborhoods were being established just west of our area, a complex of neighborhoods was extending north from the area of White Rock Lake. These neighborhoods would come to be called Lake Highlands. The original neighborhood identified as Lake Highlands is south of Northwest Highway and east of the lake. Today it's called Old Lake Highlands and was originally laid out in 1946. By the 1950s, new Dallas neighborhoods were being developed north of Northwest Highway, and by the 1960s, these neighborhoods were approaching our area. The Richardson Independent School District established Lake Highlands High School in the early 1960s to serve the needs of these growing neighborhoods. Lake Highlands High School graduated its first class of students in 1964. At about the same time, the cities of Richardson and Garland were also extending suburban developments in the direction of the old Hawks properties. The development of this area involved not only the building of single-family homes, but also some areas of higher density population, including businesses, apartments, and condominiums located on the larger thoroughfares in the area. Businesses grew up along Forest Lane at the corner of Abrams Road and Royal Lane, and a few locations along Greenville Avenue. From the early 1970s, apartments were built along Forest Lane, and these would eventually extend westward all the way to the intersection of Forest and Audelia, with some apartments on Greenville just north of Forest Lane and on Abrams Road just south of Forest. Between 1967 and 1984, the Dallas Cowboys practice facility was located on the north side of Forest Lane, west of Abrams Road. In the 1970s, a hotel was located next to the practice field, and the Cowboys' opposing teams were known to rent the higher floors of this hotel prior to games in Dallas, giving them scenic views, shall we say, of the Cowboys' practice field. Some businesses along Forest Lane capitalized on the Cowboys' presence, so Dallas City directories in the 1970s show Cowboy Cleaners and Cowboy Auto Parts on Forest Lane. Who wouldn't want to live near the Cowboys' practice field? Perhaps it's no coincidence that the development of the Forest Meadow, Moss Farm, and Town Creek neighborhoods began in the same year that the Cowboys' training field had come to the area. These neighborhoods were not developed as whole units, but rather as smaller subdivisions that eventually added up to our present neighborhoods. Although the first plats in the area were identified as Forest Meadow, they were east of Abrams Road in the area that's now described as Town Creek. Similarly, some of the earliest subdivisions that would become Moss Farm, the subdivisions adjacent to Whitehurst Road, were also initially labeled as parts of Forest Meadow. These subdivisions were developed in phases beginning in 1967, when the first plat identified as Forest Meadow was registered in Dallas County. Plats are maps of proposed development showing individual lots into which the neighborhood is divided, with streets and easements shown. Building might not begin for a year or more after a plat was registered. The Dallas Morning News began carrying advertisements for homes in the Forest Meadow area from 1969. Plats for subdivisions identified as Town Creek were registered beginning in 1972. The first two of these plats consisted entirely of property that had been part of the upper tract of the Hawks property. They were developed by Grant Properties, who announced the development in the Dallas Morning News late in 1972. All the rest of the Town Creek tracts were located primarily on the Hawks grant, but also with some property from other early grants. In the early 1970s, these neighborhoods extended only a few streets south of Whitehurst Road, and at that point they were identified as Forest Meadow. A proposal was made to the city of Dallas to zone an extensive area south of there for the construction of apartments. This would have extended apartment developments all the way from Northwest Highway out to where Moss Farm is now located. Area residents strongly objected to these proposals and even organized buses to carry residents to a zoning meeting where they expressed their objections. Two developments occurred as a result of this. The first was that an extensive portion of the Moss property was given to the city of Dallas as the Harry S. Moss Park, which opened in 1978. The second development was that the area immediately south of Forest Meadow was further developed for single-family residences, and this became the bulk of the Moss Farm neighborhood. The first plats identified as Moss Farm were registered in 1975. The land that was incorporated into Moss Farm included much of the Hawks lower tract, but it also included parts of the old Sloan Jackson property and some of the Alexander Thomas property as well. These subdivisions continued to grow through the later 1970s and the early 1980s. I'm going to give you two examples of specific subdivisions that were built in Forest Meadow. The first example is the subdivision that was called Bill Brown's Farm and is now part of Forest Meadow. On June 14, 1976, less than a month before the celebration of the U.S. bicentennial on July 4th of that year, Catherine Brown, the widow of W.A. Bill Brown, sold 18.6 acres, the majority of the old Brown farm, to the Mac Bull Development Company. A year later, they had subdivided the property into the Bill Brown's Farm subdivision. On January the 8th, 1978, the Dallas Morning News carried a story indicating that 21 homes were available for viewing in the Bill Brown's Farm subdivision, with prices ranging from $80,000 to $100,000. A second example of a subdivision is the Topaz Estates development adjacent to Bill Brown's Farm. On February 23, 1978, Dallas nursery developer Ralph Pincus sold a tract of 12 acres to the Topaz Development Company. By this time, the Bill Brown's Farm subdivision was already underway, and Topaz Development moved quickly to prepare a new subdivision, essentially the 9,000 block of Windy Crest Drive, including plots for homes as well as 2 business plots at the corner of Greenville and Windy Crest. The Dallas Morning News carried a story on March 12, 1978, announcing the development, and then on July 1, 1979, announcing that building had commenced in Topaz Estates. As these neighborhoods developed, the Richardson Independent School District worked to develop schools for them. A principal was named for the new Forest Meadow Junior High School in 1969, and the school was opened in a new facility on the corner of Whitehurst and Abrams in September 1970. The same year saw the opening of Skyview Elementary School, located in the Town Creek neighborhood and featuring a planetarium, unique among schools in this area. Moss Haven Elementary School was opened in the fall of 1976, and it backs up to the old Moss Haven home. Since the 1970s, neighborhood associations have grown up in each of these neighborhoods. The Town Creek Homeowners Association was established in 1976. In 1979, following a string of burglaries in Forest Meadow, residents established a neighborhood crime watch. In 1995, it was incorporated as the Forest Meadow Crime Patrol. A similar organization was formed in 1994 in the Moss Farm neighborhood, the Moss Farm Alliance Against Crime. Although all of these associations have a central interest in crime prevention, they also serve broader concerns for the well-being of their neighborhoods. The Moss Farm Alliance, for example, states that its goal is, quote, to preserve those things that make our corner of the Lake Highlands area of Dallas a very safe and special neighborhood to live in, and second, to improve upon those things which can make our neighborhood an even better place to call home. This area of Dallas has attracted other institutions and businesses in the last 4 decades. The Royal Oaks Country Club was built along White Rock Creek in 1969. The mid-1970s saw the opening of the Forest Green branch of the Dallas Public Library. The Episcopal Church of the Ascension, which had been founded as a parish in 1958, moved to its location on Greenville Avenue in 1981. In 1990, the congregation of the Gaston Avenue Baptist Church in East Dallas, a historic congregation founded in 1887, moved to a new location on the corner of Greenville and Royal Lane, and from that time they took up the name Gaston Oaks Baptist Church. In the late 1990s, the Vencour Kindred Hospital, specializing in long-term critical care, was built on Greenville Avenue. In January of the year 2000, the Lake Highlands YMCA opened on the corner of Stoltz Road and Greenville Avenue. As the area has grown, roads and other means of transportation have seen a great deal of improvement. In the late 1970s, Greenville Avenue was widened from 4 lanes to 6 lanes. At about the same time, the stretch of Royal Lane between Abrams Road and North Central Expressway was completed. North Central Expressway itself was extensively redesigned and rebuilt in the period between 1992 and 1996. In 2006, the newly renovated High 5 intersection, the intersection of the LBJ Freeway and North Central Expressway, was opened, sporting design elements based on the Centennial buildings on the Texas State Fairgrounds. In the mid-1990s, the DART light rail system began service, and the Forest Lane DART rail station was opened on July 1, 2002. I began at my house, and I'll conclude here as well. In the month of February 1964, a group called the Beatles performed on the Ed Sullivan Show. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, ask your parents or your grandparents. In that month, the land where our house now sits was sold by members of the Hawks family. But this particular corner of land had been in the possession of the Hawks family for 109 years. From 1855, when Governor Pease granted the Hawks upper tract of 640 acres to the heirs of James M. Hawks, until that month when Hannah Hawks Hunt, remember Hannah, the daughter of Nicholas T. Hawks, then at age 79 sold the property to Dallas nursery developer Ralph Pincus. Ralph Pincus later sold it to Topaz Development Company, who developed our little stretch of Windy Crest Drive. So it was only 47 years ago, when I was in the 4th grade, that this was a rural area still in the hands of its pioneer family, the Hawks family. My old scoutmaster, who is buried at Restland, used to say, "Boys, we need to leave the campsite better than we found it." Well, this is our campsite. We need to tend it so we can hand it on better than we found it to those who come after us. I believe that part of tending a place like this is to cultivate its history, to preserve the memory of those like the Hawks family who tended this place long before we came here. Thank you for watching, and welcome to Houxland.